I found an old family album in the attic. When I asked my parents about the photos, they insisted they didn't recognize anyone. But when I took the album to an expert, he told me it was a family that had vanished over a century ago, in our very house. It all started with a trip to the attic, a part of the house I'd always avoided. You know the kind of attic I'm talking about. Dark, full of cobwebs, a few dead flies in the windows, and that musty smell that feels like it hasn't moved in decades. I wasn't up there for anything exciting. My mom had asked me to find an old suitcase because she wanted to declutter. Typical Saturday chore. That's when I saw it. It was shoved to the back of the attic, hidden under a frayed blanket in the corner. A large, leather-bound book. The cover was faded, the leather cracked at the edges, but I could still see the embossed floral design. It didn't look like it belonged to anything we owned. My parents weren't sentimental about heirlooms. They didn't keep anything this delicate. I figured it was some old photo album, so I flipped it open. The photographs were old, really old. They were sepia-toned, the kind you see in history books or museums. A man with a sharp suit and a thick mustache stared back at me in one photo, his eyes hollow and intense. Next to him was a woman wearing a high-neck dress, her face pale and soft, her expression almost sad. They weren't smiling. None of them were smiling. There were children, 2, 3 of them. The youngest, a little boy holding a wooden toy, looked straight into the camera. It felt like he was looking right through me. At first, I thought it was cool. Maybe these were distant relatives or something. The house we live in isn't exactly new. It's one of those old Victorian places built when people were still riding around in carriages. My parents had told me it had been in the family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next. I brought the album downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. My mom and dad were both there, finishing up lunch. "Hey, whose is this?" I asked, sliding the album across the table toward them. My dad barely glanced at it. "No idea. Probably from the previous owners." That didn't make sense. "This house has been in our family forever," I said. "There weren't any previous owners." My mom looked at the photos for a bit longer. Her face didn't change, but I saw her lips tighten. "I don't recognize anyone," she said. "Must have been left by someone else." Someone else? In our attic? For a house they supposedly never owned? None of it made sense. But what really threw me was how quickly they dismissed it. My parents are the kind of people who go nuts over anything remotely tied to family history. My dad once spent 6 months tracing our family tree back to some German immigrants in the 1800s. For them to just wave this off? It felt weird. Suspicious, even. I tried to press them on it later that night. My dad got irritated. "Darvin, drop it," he said. "It's just an old photo album. Why are you so worked up about this?" I wasn't worked up. Not yet, anyway. But the more they brushed it off, the more it gnawed at me. Why didn't they want to talk about it? Why did they seem scared? I couldn't let it go. I kept the album in my room, flipping through the pages over and over. The family wasn't big, just the man, the woman, and the 3 kids. They looked well off, judging by their clothes and the props in some of the photos. But something felt off about them. It wasn't just the lack of smiles. It was the way they were posed. Stiff. Almost like they were trying too hard to look natural but failing miserably. Then I noticed the little details. The toy the youngest boy was holding, it looked like one of the carvings on our staircase. The woman's necklace, it was identical to one I'd seen in my mom's jewelry box, tucked away in the drawer she barely touched. And the background in one of the photos? I was almost certain it was our living room, just different. There was no mistaking the fireplace. It had the same pattern of tiles. I confronted my mom again the next morning. "Are you sure you don't know anything about these people?" I asked, pointing to the album. She sighed and rubbed her temples like I was giving her a headache. "Darvin, it's just some old junk. Let it go." She was lying. I could feel it. My mom doesn't usually lie, but she's a terrible liar when she does. Her voice gets tight, and she avoids eye contact. That's exactly what she was doing now. I decided to take matters into my own hands. If my parents weren't going to give me answers, I'd find someone who could. I did some Googling and found a local historian, Professor Albert Carswell. He specialized in regional history and antique photography, and his office wasn't far, just a 30-minute drive to the next town over. When I showed him the album, his reaction made the hairs on my arm stand up. He stared at it like it was radioactive. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my attic," I said. "Do you know who they are?" He nodded slowly. "This is the Calder family. They disappeared in 1907. "Disappeared?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean they vanished." One night, they were here. The next, they weren't. No one ever found out what happened to them. A cold knot formed in my stomach. How is that possible? He leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. The Calders were a prominent family around here, wealthy, well-connected. But one night, neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from their house. Cries, banging, things they couldn't explain. When someone finally went to check, the house was empty. It was as if they had been plucked off the face of the earth. I stared at him, my throat dry. But why would their album be in my attic? That, he said, is the real question. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. A family vanished in 1907, leaving no trace, except this album. And it had been sitting in our attic, in our house. None of it made sense. I opened the album again, this time looking for anything I might have missed. That's when I noticed one of the pages felt thicker than the rest. Curious, I carefully pried it apart and found a folded piece of paper hidden between them. The handwriting was elegant, but the ink had faded with time. The note read, "To whoever finds this. We tried to leave, but the house won't let us. The shadows move. The walls whisper. There is no escape. If you are reading this, leave while you still can. The truth lies buried, but it is not worth the cost." I sat there, holding the note in my shaking hands, trying to comprehend what it meant. The house won't let them leave? Shadows? Walls that whisper? I wanted to dismiss it as paranoid rambling, but something deep inside me told me it was real. I couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. I couldn't sleep after finding that note. Every creak of the house felt louder, every shadow seemed darker. I stayed up all night staring at the album, turning the pages again and again, as if I might find more hidden secrets. The faces in the photos almost seemed to change under the dim light of my desk lamp, their eyes following me, accusing me, daring me to dig deeper. But I wasn't going to stop. If the Calders had been trapped here, if they'd suffered in this house, I was going to figure out why. More than that, I was going to make it right. The next morning, I went back to the attic. Something about the place felt different now, heavier, like the air itself was pressing against me. I started tearing through boxes, pulling apart old trunks, and tapping on the walls and floorboards, searching for anything out of place. Hours passed before I found it, a trapdoor beneath an old rug in the far corner of the attic. The edges were so perfectly aligned with the wood floor that it was almost invisible. The door was nailed shut, but a crowbar from the garage made short work of that. Beneath it was a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The air that came up was damp and sour, carrying a metallic tang that made me gag. But I wasn't about to stop now. The stairs led to a hidden basement, one that clearly hadn't been touched in decades. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture. In the center of the room was a wooden table covered in strange symbols carved deep into its surface. Around it were scattered objects, candles burned down to stubs, a rusted dagger, and piles of animal bones. But the thing that caught my attention most was a second trapdoor, this one smaller, set directly into the floor beneath the table. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside was a shallow pit filled with human bones. Skulls, ribs, femurs. They were all there, piled haphazardly, as if someone had dumped them in a hurry. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. This was it. This was where the Calders had ended up. Or at least, what was left of them. I confronted my parents that evening. I didn't bother with subtlety. I slammed the photo album on the dining table and threw the note next to it. "What do you know about this?" I demanded. My mom went pale. My dad's face hardened. "Darvin, you need to let this go," he said, his voice low and even. "Let it go?" I yelled. "There are bones under the attic. Human bones. The Calders were murdered here, and you're telling me to let it go?" My mom broke into sobs, but my dad just stared at me, his jaw clenched. "We don't talk about the house," he said finally. "That's the rule. We don't talk about what happened here. That's how we stay safe." "Safe from what?" I shouted. "The ghosts of the Calders? The thing that killed them?" My dad didn't answer. He just shook his head and walked away. My mom followed, her face streaked with tears. I was left standing there, furious and confused. What were they hiding? And why were they so afraid? I went back to Professor Carswell the next day. I told him everything, the note, the hidden basement, the bones. He listened quietly, nodding along, his face growing grimmer with every word. "This house," he said finally, "it's cursed." "Cursed?" I repeated, half laughing. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm not," he said. "The Calders weren't the first victims. That house has a history. Every family that's lived there has suffered. Death, madness, disappearances. The house, it feeds on them." "Feeds?" I asked, the word making my skin crawl. Not literally, he said. But it thrives on pain, on fear. It traps people, drives them to destruction. And from what you're telling me, it hasn't stopped. If the house wanted fear, it wasn't going to get it from me. I was done being scared. The Calders didn't deserve to be forgotten, and I wasn't going to let that thing, whatever it was, keep winning. I went back to the basement that night, armed with gasoline and a lighter. The house had taken enough. It wasn't going to take anything else. I poured the gas over everything, the table, the bones, the walls, soaking the space until the fumes made my head spin. I didn't hesitate. I struck the lighter and dropped it. The fire roared to life instantly, the flames licking up the walls and across the floor. I scrambled back up the stairs, coughing and choking on the smoke. The heat was intense, like the house itself was screaming in rage. But I didn't stop. I ran through the house, lighting fires in every room, watching as the flames consumed it. The walls groaned, the floors cracked, and the air filled with the sound of splintering wood. By the time I was outside, the entire house was ablaze. My parents were standing in the yard, staring in horror. My dad grabbed me by the shoulders, shaking me. "What did you do?" he shouted. "I ended it," I said, my voice calm. "The house doesn't get to hurt anyone else." For a moment, he looked like he might hit me. But then his face crumpled, and he sank to his knees. My mom stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. The flames roared behind us, consuming the house and everything in it. In the weeks that followed, the fire was ruled an accident. No one knew about the basement, the bones, or the truth. I didn't tell anyone. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the house was gone, and with it, the curse. For the first time in years, I felt free. The Calders weren't haunting me anymore. If anything, it felt like they were at peace. And as I stood in the empty lot where the house used to be, I knew one thing for certain: whatever darkness had lived there was gone.